Thank you. I have a follow-up question as we're disambiguating what open might mean. In the Q&A, Nathan asks, some publications expect authors to pay money for open access, which can look like a vanity press, and not all authors are equally situated to afford paying money for publication. He sees that as a potential problem. I'm guessing that your center is not advancing these types of open access journals, but do you have a thought on that? And any panelists, please weigh in.
Yeah, it's somewhat unavoidable, that perception with a lot of open access journals, and the rise of predatory journals really exemplifies the problematic aspect of that. And what we're trying to advocate is to sort of focus more on, as much as possible, on the transparency of the overall research process, more so than the outlet of the publication. We evaluate journal policies based on the degree to which they follow the recommendations and the transparency and openness promotion guidelines, as an alternative to the impact factor, which is useful for some reasons, for some means, but it shouldn't be used as a proxy for how good a journal is or how good individual research articles are in which they're published. Generally, we're trying to solve that problem that Nathan mentioned in the chat. There's no perfect solution, and we think preprints are probably the main important solution to that. It quickly, Nicole, as you mentioned, it speeds up the dissemination of early research findings. It provides a venue for accessing work regardless of the business model that was used to publish it. And one thing I really like about preprints is that a lot of people, especially in the news media, are trained to look at them with a little bit of skepticism. So oftentimes, and this came up a lot in the pandemic, an early research finding that hasn't yet been peer reviewed is being treated with an appropriate amount of skepticism. Frankly, we think that that same amount of skepticism should be applied to any research that hasn't been replicated or hasn't been confirmed through sort of independent steps. Oftentimes we take peer review as a golden mark of approval that can iron out all sins, and we know that that's not true. Sometimes it's, for lots of reasons I think the panel knows, sometimes it's rushed, sometimes it's biased. It's, I think, like Winston Churchill said, it's democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Peer review is the best way to sort of disseminate some research findings, except for all of its flaws. But all sorts of research and the credibility and rigor of work that goes into preprints is about on par with work that ends up in the final published literature. So the fact that they're treated with skepticism is a good thing, and I would translate that type of skepticism more broadly.
Well, I think there may be an opportunity to shift sort of where in the process the journal and the journal editor comes in. And I take the registered report concept to be sort of moving it earlier in the process before the results come out. Adam, I think you might be an advocate for maybe getting rid of it altogether. Okay, you're not advocating, but in your career, you're not going to engage with them in that way. Could it also move to the end of the process, sort of after publication altogether? I mean, we don't literally need these journals to disseminate. We have the internet. We don't need to print and mail things. They're not hard to find. Could they evolve into sort of awards associations, like the people who give out the Grammys, and we all look at the scholarship, and then you still have to, you can give out the status that everyone needs? Or am I a non-academic and just crazy? Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think so. There's this this law from game theory called Goodhart's law that a lot of people are probably familiar with. But if you're not, just the idea that once a measure becomes a target, it ceases where my very recent employer, Columbia, just like doctored their numbers to increase their standing. And the problem, the thing about Goodhart's law is, as far as I know, we don't have an antidote to it. This just appears to be how the world works. Like, you can do a better or worse job of aligning people's incentives with the way that you actually want them to act. But there's always some gap between those things. And so I think even if you put the incentives at the end, then I think you still incentivize people to publish papers in such a way that, like, I know, like, I get some sense of how to create the thing that eventually science is going to stamp with its approval stamp on it. I was reading an article a while back about the campaigns that movies do to get Academy Awards, and of like the places that they put billboards so that the right people see them. And you might just think that, like, well, we just make movies and then they vote on which ones are best. And like, no, the ones that win are the ones that like play this very canny game of making sure the right people see the right movies at the right time and think about them in the right way and have the right narrative for why that movie is a good movie. And I think we would see the same with science, which is why I think we shouldn't try to incentive engineer ourselves or fool ourselves into thinking that we can incentive engineer ourselves out of the situation. I think the only solution is to have competing incentives that other people are abiding by. And so if something is published by someone who's under the incentive of, I need to get this in the best journal possible, I also want someone working on that question. I just have a grant that lets me live for 5 years and I can do whatever I want. And like, I think it's a good use of my time to like check this thing and see if it works or work on this problem. And if they all end up at the same answer, then we can be pretty certain that it's true. And maybe that's important because it's attracted people who had different reasons of doing research in the first place. That'd be my answer.
Yeah.
And I think that gets at a bigger point too of the centrality of publications in academic careers. So like, you don't really, as of right now, our system's not set up great for people that just want to do, you know, kind of more exploratory research, because everything is tied to publications, like your career advancement, your funding opportunities, your lab, your trainees, like everything gets tied to funding. And centrally, all that funding's tied back to publications when it comes to it. So I think if we can, you know, I think all the changes, innovations we've done to like the peer review process and like research publishing, we also need to think about the systems that also support it, like our funding models, like our federal funding models, like the NIH and NSF, which are the two big ones. We need to think about how those models change, how our hiring committees change, our training programs change and adapt. So I think I like the idea, Adam, of like the competing incentives. And I think that would be probably the best solution for that. But we need to also like decouple publications from being like the top goal of doing an academic career. Because then we're left with folks that don't want to necessarily play that game, end up leaving out of the traditional track. So we're just leaving, you know, folks that, you know, can play that game better or have the resources and opportunities to play that game better. So we need to make sure that we can keep people in the academic system with kind of taking different approaches to research and publishing.